carefully in the back of the hymnal after the hymns. We have a great deal more kindness than is ever spoken.
The whole human family is bathed with the element of love of the divine nature.
How many persons we meet in houses whom we scarcely speak to, whom yet we honor and who honor us.
How many we see in the street or sit with in church, whose society we warmly rejoice to see with them.
Read the language of these wandering eye-beams.
The heart knows.
So I have not, I use a fair amount of media in when I wear my other hat as a professor of world religions and psychology, but it's been rather rare that I've attempted to integrate images into sermons, and I suspect we will discover soon why that is so rare. And so there's about 7 themes through this talk that are anchored in visual images. And the first theme is there are many ways to travel. And my wife and I went to Japan. It was the first time we had been overseas together, which was an adventure. And I'm pleased to say we were good friends when we left and good friends when we came back after 10 days together. And a couple of those ways of traveling can be designated as tourist and pilgrim. And we were not very good tourists. Tourists travel often for their own convenience on their own terms. They seek the comforts of home when they are on the road, and so they seek out familiar food, familiar lodging, familiar vistas, and if you're persistent enough, everything becomes like McDonald's, or every lodging becomes like Hojo or Howard Johnson's. Tourists move quickly and snap lots of pictures. They cover a lot of ground, and my take on it was, for the most part, we were miserable failures as tourists. We didn't want to see 6 shrines in 3 hours, or 3 shrines and 3 temples. We wanted to spend an hour at one place. But there's another way of traveling, and that's to be a pilgrim. And to be a pilgrim is to be willing to travel outside of your own comfort zone and to try to learn something new. When we're acting as pilgrims, we can appreciate the differences of other cultures without trying to convert them into convenient similarities. We're willing to learn by watching and listening. We don't have to be in charge. We move slowly, gather impressions, and we find beauty in the moment. And this is my wife, Kristen, and she grew up in Wayzata surrounded by several dozen beautiful maples. And so whenever we travel, we seek out maples, and these are a Japanese maple tree, and we arrived in May, which is the maple season. Luckily, we missed the cherry blossom season when everything is full and the prices are double. And these Amur maples have very thin leaves. The parts of the leaf are maybe half an inch wide. And Kristen is just beaming because she's in front of a Japanese maple in a Japanese garden. But she's beaming because I suspect she's feeling the resonance. She's feeling the connection between this maple and the maples that surrounded her in childhood and the maples that we have where we live in the forests of Frontenac. And so when we travel slowly, when we're not in a rush, when we're not strapped to a camera, we can become for a few moments or hours a pilgrim And one of the joys of being a pilgrim is to open ourselves so these deep connections between the present landscape and the treasured landscapes of our past, the connections can be made and rise to consciousness. One of our former presidents of the Unitarian Universalist Association was a wonderful rascal named Bill Schulz. And among his many gifts was he was just a great storyteller. And he traveled to Japan, and he wanted to be a pilgrim. He wanted to meet Japan on its own terms. And so Bill volunteered to go to a mountainous region where there were beautiful waterfalls, and he went through the purification ritual that is done in the Shinto faith. And then what you do is you have an elaborate process of you bathe the two hands, and then you bathe your mouth, and then you're dressed in a white robe. And the culmination of this ritual is to go out and slowly walk and then stand under an ice-cold waterfall. And what you're supposed to do when the ice-cold water hits your head is to call out the name of the kami, or spirit. That's K-A-M-I, not C-O-M-M-E-I-E, the spirit of the waterfall. And Bill was determined to go through this ritual, and he got under the ice-cold waterfall, and this stream of water hit his head. He said, "Oh, Jesus Christ, it's cold." And the Shinto priest said, "Wrong kami, Reverend Bill, wrong kami." So even when we're being pilgrims, we might be overwhelmed by the challenges of water that was, 40 degrees and falling 100 feet. So the first point is, when we travel, we can be pilgrims, we can be tourists, we can be wanderers, we can get lost. We failed as tourists, but we did have our moments as pilgrims. Second idea is that our pilgrimage began before we were born. In the 1830s and 40s, this guy, Henry David Thoreau, and his mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, they were among the first generation of American writers who had access to Oriental scriptures. And both Emerson and Thoreau, in their writings and in their life, turned east. And they found in the sacred texts of India, the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, they found in translations of Buddhist scripture something that was remarkable. And to try to encapsulate it in a single word is impossible. But that, of course, will not prevent me from trying. I think what they discovered was a light, that there was a light within the human heart and mind. And there is a light in the natural world. And when we open up the gates of our heart and our mind and our senses, those two lights meet, and if we're lucky or persistent, we wake up. And so this pilgrimage of mine started 150 years before I was born in the writings of Thoreau and Emerson. My pilgrimage also began with my father's life, because my dad was stationed in Japan after the Second World War. He wanted to stay. He wrote, I'm sure, humorous articles for Stars and Stripes magazine, which was the magazine of the armed forces. He was offered a job to stay an additional 2 years in Japan. He desperately wanted to do that. My mom, who was born in Albion, Nebraska, a town of about 1,000, said, "Absolutely not, Theodore, you're coming home," and he did. But I suspect that my interest in Japan and its culture over the years has something to do with my dad's unlived life in Japan. And so when I traveled to Japan, I quite consciously attempted to bring some of my father's friendly optimism and love of meeting new people and my mother's inward directed spiritual practice and her love of beautiful gardens. Pilgrims need roots. Pilgrims need inspiration. And pilgrims need good company. When we arrived in Japan, we discovered that there are actually two Japans in close juxtaposition. In the foreground, you see a beautiful Japanese garden. It's in what's called New Tokyo or Makahari Bay, and they've recreated a very traditional Japanese meditation garden. And between it, you see multi-story buildings in which people live. There are two Japans, the old and the new, Kyoto and Tokyo, old-fashioned trains and trolleys and bullet trains, and both are important. Japan is a nation who seems to have an unusual capacity to honor its past even as they are inventing the future. And this image here of the old Japan in the foreground and the new Japan in the background represents one of the discoveries we made on our pilgrimage, that it is possible, if we care about the past, if we care about the continuity between the past and the future, it's possible to create a culture that does both very well. And often the old and new Japan are juxtaposed side by side. This beautiful meditation garden we discovered by the internet was less than 5 minutes away from Appa Hotel and Resort where we stayed, which is a 50-story hotel. So the ultra-modern and the pre-modern side by side. Fourth thing we discovered is Japan, since the Second World War, has chosen to invest in technologies that seem to benefit ordinary people. Isn't that an amazing thought? And of course, in a peculiar way we helped, and I had a slide in here of what was left of Tokyo after we firebombed it, by eliminating much of their pre-World War II infrastructure in Japan as well as Germany. We gave them an opportunity to rebuild from the ground up. And they've invested in things like bullet trains. Trains that connect all the major cities in Japan. They travel up to, I think their speed limit is 189 miles an hour. And if you get on the right train, they're flawless. I thought, oh gee, maybe I'll throw up. So I didn't eat too much before I got on the retrain. Not a problem. It's smooth, nobody got sick. And on the Japanese, at least on the bullet trains, you can either do free seating or assigned seating. And they have conductors who are these great, big, burly Japanese guys in the train we were on. And about every 15 minutes, they walk through the train, they nod at everyone, and then they come up to the front of the train, they face everyone, and then they bow. And if you're hip, you nod your head back. And this is a reciprocal gesture, which is signifying it's okay. The train is running smoothly. There's not a problem here. And it's remarkable the power of that gesture to create a sense of this is a space that we share. This is a space for which we are jointly responsible. Let's all be on our best behavior. Another sign of attending to the convenience of ordinary people, and I didn't throw in a slide for this, is they have convenience stores in Japan that are actually convenient. Lawson's and 7-Eleven, and they're designed to meet the needs of ordinary travelers. So if you didn't bring enough yen, and of course we didn't, you can go to Lawson's and you put your debit card or credit card into a machine, and they charge, I think, 8 or 9%, and out comes 2,000 yen or 20. I think I got 20,000 yen, which is a couple $100. And if you can't drink a large bottle of sake, which we couldn't, we bought a very nice bottle and had to leave it in the hotel because we didn't want to bring it on the train. In a Lawson's, you could buy 300 milliliters of really fine sake that's better than most of the stuff I've had in this country, for about $4. And if you like matcha ice cream, as we do, and this is the powdered green tea that they make into absolutely splendid ice cream, and you're not near a parlor, you can go to a convenience store, and for $4, you can get really good matcha ice cream on a really good cone. And if you're about to jump on a bullet train or forgot about lunch, you can go into a convenience store and for $5 to $10 get really good Japanese food that was probably made fresh that morning. And we didn't have, we learned 2 words, which I'm going to share with you. Thank you, arigato, 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 and I'm sorry, konnichiwa, konnichiwa, konnichiwa. Those 2 words got us through 9 days in Japan. Because wherever we went, there were people who knew a little bit of English and who were perfectly willing to work with us to, sometimes we would have a team of 3 or 4 trying to get an answer to a question like, where do I catch the bus to go somewhere? And so we found the Japanese people that we met, whether they knew a little English or a lot of English, remarkably helpful. And so we could get where we needed to go. And in Japan, mass transit works. Trains run on time. The bullet trains are maybe $90 for a trip from one major city to another. The local JR lines are less than 5. Most signs are bilingual. We didn't have to worry about being mugged or panhandled, because there appears to be very little casual crime, at least in the neighborhoods we chose to hang out. Tipping is regarded as impolite. Burping and slurping is regarded as praise for the cook. Kindness and generosity are everywhere. As Emerson said, we found the Japanese people that we met to be good-hearted. It took a 13-hour flight for us to travel to Japan, and when we got off the plane, we were a little dazed after watching 3 or 4 movies, and you go through customs, and then we got out into the large area of the airport. We walk into the room where we were told we could find a connection to our bus, and we were grabbed onto by a television crew, Japanese television, that were interviewing likely looking tourists. And they said, would you like to be interviewed? And I said, I would be happy to be interviewed, and I'll take as long as you want if you will help us find the bus to Appa Hotel and Spa in Makahuri Bay. And so they did their interview, and they had a superb translator, and then 2 or 3 people put their heads together, and they got us eventually connected to the bus that took us directly to our hotel for the grand sum of $10. It was about a 30-mile trip. And fifth point I want to make is every culture is good at something. We seem to be good at producing guns and allowing people who are deeply troubled to get a hold of them. Every culture has gifts and limitations. The Japanese, as far as we are concerned, have mastered at least 3 things: the bed, the bar, the bath, the tea house, and the garden. The hotel rooms are small by American standards, but Kristen and I are small by American standards. The bath room usually focuses or features a tub that you can sit in, and it's shorter than the American tub. So you can fill it, if you're willing to flex your knees, you can be fully immersed in bath water and only use about 30 gallons. And this bathroom is set up like a trailer because the same faucet fills the sink and fills the tub. And as for the Japanese toilets, all I can say is once you've experienced a Japanese toilet, you may not go back to an American toilet. And for whatever holiday comes next, I am buying my wife one of these Japanese toilets that are remarkably civilized. Now, one thing we did not take advantage of in our hotel was they have onsen or public baths. And we couldn't find anybody that spoke good enough English that would teach us the rules because on 4th floor they had bathing for men and women. On the 2nd floor they had bathing for women only, and it's bathing without the benefit of the bathing suit. And I don't think we were so much shy as we were concerned that we would do something foolish and stupid and not. So before we go back to Japan, somewhere on YouTube, I'm sure, there are instructions on how a Westerner can politely participate in a public bath. Point number 6, we have rarely met more courteous, frugal, and kindly people. We depended on the kindness of strangers. We had hoped, of course, that the little Google translator on our cell phones would get us through difficult situations. It worked like a charm as long as we were in this country. As soon as we got to Japan, even though both cell phones were supposed to work, neither one did. And so our translator didn't work. We also discovered in Japan that the best restaurants are rarely written down in any book. The best restaurants that we found were found by intuition. And the way we would find a restaurant is we would, and this usually happened mid to late afternoon, we'd stop participating in the tour. We'd tell the tour guides, look, we're just gonna sit here. And I would say, I'm tired of walking around. I know that looking at this castle where 10,000 people died will be exciting for some, and there's great pictures to be taken. I'm just gonna sit here. And so I would sit for an hour, and after sitting for a while, even if you don't have a particularly formal practice, what I experience is the mind gets calmer, the heart gets calmer, my perceptual field, what I see, what I hear, what I sense, and so forth, gets clearer. And then when I am awake, as Thoreau might say, I can often find what I need. And in Osaka, or Osaka as we say, there's no parking in Osaka because it's such a popular place. So our bus stopped on a bridge and we all had to get out and pledge to come back in exactly an hour. We get off the bus, I sit for 10 minutes, and then I see the restaurant marquee that appears to be this huge white ball, which didn't mean anything to me. And then I looked at the windows and they'd taken great care to put vertical strips of beautiful Japanese cedar so that there was privacy both ways. And it felt like a place that I'd want to visit. So we went in, and there were not a lot of English speakers there, and the entire menu was in Japanese. But they had a little card that they would give to guests. And it was a 3rd generation Buddhist restaurant in Osaka. And their specialty was handmade noodles. So of course we ordered the specialty of the house, which is the huge bowl of noodles. And the noodles were about 2 feet long, hence the big spoons. And then they had, we also got some sushi, and it's a fishing port. So that fish was probably caught this morning. It was the best noodle soup and the best sushi we've ever had. And for 2 of us, I think the total was $27, which was typical. The best restaurants were under $30. The best places to stay that we found, the hotels, were about $50 a night with the Priceline Expedia discount. Seventh point is it gets light early in Japan. And I don't know, this probably has something to do with longitude and latitude. At about 4 a.m. it would start to get light. And so by 4:30, I'd be awake, which meant by 5:30 I was up. And when you get up at 4:30 or 5, the days become much longer. And there are endless opportunities to pay attention, to wake up when you start that early. And several days we managed to find a Zen garden that was within walking distance, and we'd go out as soon as they would open. Most of the gardens were free to walk in. And then in the garden that was right next to this 50-story hotel, they had a beautiful tea house. And for 400 yen, which is a grand total of $4, you could participate in traditional Japanese tea ceremony. And they had modified it for Westerners so that you could sit at a bench and drink from a bench. And so for $4 a piece, we had an hour-long walk in a garden and participated in a beautiful tea ceremony, and that's how we started our days. And so if you're interested in exploring what it means to be a pilgrim, I invite you to do this, which is nothing, but nothing done as well as possible. You know? My posture is not very good. The spine should be a little straighter. I do have both feet on the ground, which is very useful. But the point is, just stop trying to do everything. Just sit there and pay attention. And I developed, I didn't want to make a big deal out of meditating. So I developed a way of sitting on a bench or sitting on a rock where anybody that had an interior practice could tell what I was up to, but I was not flashing a sign, I'm an American and I'm meditating. Isn't that wonderful? And this practice allowed me to shift out of the tourist mode, set aside my camera, and be a little more fully present. And my wonderful discovery, time and again, is that when we allow ourselves to be gathered in the present moment, whatever we need is right there. And we can see it to the extent that we're not trying to snap pictures and take notes and make an impression or win an argument. And we took a walk, our second to last day. We had a very energetic couple who'd emigrated to Boston from Russia about 30 years ago. And they were both in their 70s, and they were just incredible walkers. And they're used to walking 7 or 8 miles a day. So we went to, the deal that we made with them the second to last day is you can bring us to 2 or 3 temples and we'll attempt to keep up. And in return, we ask you to walk through a Japanese garden that was adjacent, and let's not talk too much. So we did 2 or 3 temples, and then we at last got to the garden, and we were starting to walk through, and one of my walking companions from Russia said, "Beautiful garden, but no benches. Benches must be too expensive." And as she said that, which I would characterize as kvetching, this happened. A Siberian crane flew overhead. Oh, did it go?
It went too far.
It went too fast. As she was kvetching about what was not in the garden, benches, she might have missed 1 or 2 things, such as this Siberian crane that flew overhead. And so as a Qigong practitioner and someone that lives near crane, I did a little crane form and just had a lovely moment of connection. And thankfully, my wife had her hands on the cell phone and captured this beautiful image of a bird in flight, which echoes a line from Dogen, who's one of the great reformers of Zen Buddhism. A bird in flight leaves no trace. Who is it we spend our whole life loving? So my wife and I traveled a very long way, about 12,000 miles round trip, and yet we had a sense of coming home. Japan has created a haven for those of us that are introverts. What a relief. You don't have to chit-chat people up in public. And when you go into shops, at least in Kyoto, the shopkeepers will wait for you to signal that you need some help. They're not going to come running at you trying to sell you something that you don't need or want. We discovered that the Japanese excel at many of our own core values, that being is at least as important as doing, that paying attention with our heart and mind is at least as useful as snapping pictures, and that if we're willing to meet people and give and receive respect, we can handle whatever problem might arise. Kristen and I felt like for the first time, perhaps in our lifetimes, we were no longer strangers wandering in Jesus land, surrounded by biblical images which we understand and respect, but that's not our tradition. And it's hard to put into words what a relief it is for those of us that practice the Buddha way is to come upon a culture where the images associated with our own practice are reflected back at us. And this is a Pure Land image of Buddha with a female bodhisattva on his side that is at one of these huge Pure Land temples. And what we discovered is in the midst of this imagery, we stopped fighting with our culture, which we've been doing for over 60 years. It was a great relief. We sighed a lot. And one of my traveling contemporaries who was from Russia, when we saw these big Buddhas, her comment was, "Very big Buddhas. Who pays? Who pays for these big Buddhas?" In Japan, we found our Unitarian beliefs illuminated through an Eastern window. We believe that nature and human nature are basically good if they're not messed with too much. The universe around us is not fallen, it is not broken, it is not sinful. It is lovely to behold, and sometimes seems to be animated by lively animal spirits. And this, it's a little hard to tell because the image is stretched. This is the spirit of the fox, who's the guardian spirit of all Shinto shrines. And both the Shinto shrines and the Buddhist temples celebrate a partnership between nature and human nature. And one of the many forms that this partnership takes in Japan is they don't cut down their old trees, as we are often inclined to do. They prop them up, and Kristen is in the foreground, and in the background is what she calls Mama Ginkgo, which is a several hundred-year-old ginkgo tree that's been allowed to spread and continue its life because it has crutches supporting these big limbs. So when human nature is regarded as basically good, and human nature is regarded as belonging in nature, some amazing things can happen. Tea is still often picked by hand and tenderly processed. Trains run on time. People still bow to each other in a gesture that acknowledges the Buddha nature in you and the Buddha nature in us and how we are dwelling together. Our pilgrimage ended in front of this mural. It happens to be a copy of a Japanese painting, and this is our last day in this beautiful 50-story hotel. And we spent a couple hours sitting in the lobby, looking at this this Chinese mural, which is probably, I don't know, 12, 14 feet wide and 8 feet tall. And when you sit in front of a mural here, according to Buddhist tradition and Taoist tradition, you have at least 3 ways of regarding a mural. One is you can just look at it from the outside. And if you know anything about Japanese or Chinese painting, you can make critical comments. Second choice is you can visit the painting. You can imagine going into a particular part of the painting and giving minute attention to a particular part of it. And one of the things I did is I went up close and looked at this whole painting to see if there were any representations of human activity. Nada. None at all. The third choice that you have with a painting or in visiting another country is to dwell within it for a while. And this was our choice. We chose, when we were able, to dwell in the midst of Japanese culture, not to have too many preconceptions, and to be willing to learn. Every place we stayed had a Japanese breakfast, which is a huge buffet. And the first day we felt very awkward because we didn't know what food was where. And we would move in the wrong direction in the lines, or we would interrupt the flow. So what we did by the second day is to mentally and physically step back with our tray in our hands, and we would just stand there for a couple minutes and watch. And when we were willing to be witnesses and watchers, the crowd of people that were there, which was mainly Japanese, but also some tourists from other countries, they had their own flow pattern established. And without the use of any words at all, they would teach us where to enter the line, what to grab first, and how to be a good guest. And that might be the most important thing that we learned on this trip, that if you want to be a good guest, if you want to be a pilgrim, it's good to show up, shut up, and pay attention. However, next time we will make sure we have cell phones that work. Because the last day I tried for 15 minutes to convey to the hotel staff, the men's bathroom on the main floor is leaking. I couldn't even come close. I'm going to end with 2 pictures from our pilgrimage. Whoops. This is the 50-story structure of the Appa Hotel and Spa, which to me is emblematic of the new and ultra-modern Japan. And this is the view from the tea house that was just behind the hotel. And my impression is that the Japanese have done exceedingly well in connecting the new Japan and the old Japan, the postmodern and the pre-modern. And my hope, maybe even my prayer, is that what could we learn from that? Could we learn in this country to tenderly, lovingly connect old and new? Could we move beyond the habit of cultural warfare into building together a society that is both postmodern and pre-modern? I sure hope so. I certainly hope so. We're going to sing a beautiful Buddhist song. It's in this little teal hymnal or turquoise hymnal. My wife calls it teal, so she's correct. I'm just a guy, so I call it turquoise. It's number 1031, Filled with Loving Kindness.